Hi, I'm Rachel Flood. I am the engagement assistant at Columbia Museum of Art. This will be my third week here. It's been really fun. Everyone here is so nice. I can just tell everybody's like kind of an arts person, which has been really nice for me because I am a true arts person. So I am more always been administrative side, like arts administration. That's what I'm getting my master's in. So coming here and not knowing anything about art history, I was like, this is actually really interesting because I feel like even as a museum goer before I was here, I was just like, I don't really know too much about what's going on. Like I'd always read the descriptions and kind of figure it out that way. But it's definitely more interesting being here and then wanting to learn more about it. And then being able to do so is like so cool. In the new exhibition, French Moderns, there is a piece by Odilon Redon that I found very interesting. It has like the opal kind of colors within it. There's a lot of purples and blues, and it just looks very bright. And at the bottom of the painting, because it's a pretty long piece, there is a man fighting an angel, and you can kind of see the wings, and it kind of looks a little iridescent. So when I was reading the description for it, I did not realize that this was a biblical piece. And for me, I'm not super religious. So I actually looked the piece up afterwards, and I found out that it's like this whole story in the book of Genesis where basically Jacob is refusing his blessings from God, or he doesn't believe that they're actually true. And so this angel comes down, and he's not really here to fight Jacob. He's just here to just keep pushing, like keep going about your life. Like everything's going to get better. Everything's going to be fine. And Jacob's like, I don't believe you. So he starts fighting this angel. And it's this day and night fight. I think he pops something in his hip. And so basically the moral of the story is that Jacob just needed to learn transcendence and just to keep pushing, keep going, because God does have blessings for him. So I thought that that was a great story. I never knew about before, but it kind of felt relevant to my life in that time. So yeah, it's probably one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition.
You're listening to Binder. I'm your host, Ray McManus. All right. Well, hey, it is awesome to be back here in studio. And on top of that, it's great to have with us a guest who's not a stranger to Binder, Michael Neumeister. How you doing, Michael?
I'm doing very well, Ray. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, man.
Always a pleasure.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's good to get you out because I know you don't do much here at the museum. You just kind of hang out, and eventually somebody's like, "Hey, there's this guy Michael. You want to talk to him?"
Yeah.
No, you have been pretty busy. In fact, you just put together a show, and that's what we're going to talk about today. French Moderns. Those of you who are listening and haven't been out to see it, I would encourage you to do so. It's amazing. So, Michael, if I understand this correctly, okay, there are like 50 pieces in this thing, and these are all heavy hitters, right? I mean, tell us about what we can expect. Introduce the exhibition. Where the hell did all this stuff come from?
Yeah, good question. Well, it's French Moderns, Monet to Matisse, 1850 to 1950. So, notably, the exhibition has not one but two Monets, really recognizable and wonderful paintings. A couple by Matisse and some other artists you may have heard of, like Degas and Cézanne, and the list goes on and on. So the gang's all here, basically. Mm-hmm. Everything comes from the esteemed collection of the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and that's noteworthy because when museums travel exhibitions that are culled from their permanent collection, a lot of the times it's like 4 or 5 great works and then like 30 fillers or 30 like right. B grade, like stuff that's in storage. But these are actually cornerstones of Brooklyn's European holdings. And it was very generous and kind of amazing of them to share this, on a national tour. And actually the show had traveled internationally prior to coming back to the States. So we're really fortunate to have it all in Columbia. Yeah, I think it's an important exhibition to have here in the museum because we do have, of course, holdings of European art and modern art, but we don't have tremendous depth in that area. So we have one Monet, which is fantastic, and we're very fortunate to have. We don't have anything by Matisse. We don't have anything by Degas. So to have all these things in the building, and then, of course, to come downstairs, walk through the show, and then go upstairs and make those connections in our permanent collection is something that I'm really excited for visitors to be able to achieve.
Cool. Well, what I think is really wild here, I mean, we're talking 1850 to 1950. I mean, there's a lot that takes place in that 100-year span, right? I mean, my God. I mean, like just completely changing worldview, completely changing landscape, countries that once existed, now no longer existed, lines of demarcation change. All of these things are happening. And really, do we get a sense when we're looking at these that we kind of feel like, there is a representation of all of this change that's happening during this time?
Yeah, interestingly, like you said, it's almost impossible to talk about that 100-year period in the context of a single project,
Right.
because of the incredible range of social and cultural events and political movements that were happening. So it's organized in a way that I think kind of unpacks itself. It's organized according to almost this formal inquiry into how artists were responding to their time. So in the context of, for example, the still life section or a landscape section, you will see paintings from throughout this 100-year period. So if you're not familiar with art of this time, by the second gallery, you've seen examples of Impressionism, sort of proto-Cubism, realism, surrealism, and all of this. And it's like, you get it. Immediately you get it. It's like, oh, there's this incredible rupture in art and in culture. So it hinges on subject matter. And that's also really important from a historical context because the French Academy of Fine Art, the Royal Academy, was really, really strict in terms of the kind of art that they valued. So at the top of their hierarchy is history painting. These really huge scale, multi-figure compositions with mythological subjects or biblical subjects that often have this kind of moralizing idea around them. And at the very bottom, on the other end of the spectrum, the quote-unquote least valued paintings by the French Academy are still life paintings. So they often do have some kind of a moral idea, but there are no figures in them. Of course, they're sort of quote-unquote simplistic compositions. You won't find any history paintings in this exhibition because one of the things that modernists were rebuking in terms of tradition was the idea that you had to paint on this grand scale academic, these grandiose kind of bravura ideas. Modernists were really saying modern life and the rapidly industrializing and changing world is the thing that is most relatable to people, and this is worthy of fine art in and of itself. And then I think on the third layer, underneath all of that, you could take any painting in the show and pretty much write a dissertation on what were the cultural forces that inspired this, what socio-political movements were happening that the artist was either a part of or maybe just inspired by or maybe not even involved in, but subsumed it in some way. And that comes out, on the canvas or in the sculpture.
It's wild because, these are names that even if someone can't recall a particular piece of art, they've heard these names before, right? So from our perspective, these seem like these are rather canonical, but really in their time, they're doing things that are radical departures from what is expected of them, I suppose,
Yeah.
In the literary sense, it would be, I guess, akin to, genre bending or breaking conventions. Which I'm a massive fan for, because it's a total punk move. I mean, it's
Yeah.
So, is there a particular piece that really stands out to you that you would love to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one piece, and it was important for me to hang that. This is kind of the first piece that you walk into in the exhibition. It's by Courbet and it's called The Wave. It's just sort of this easel-sized oil painting of a single wave, coming out of the sea. And it's rendered in this really expressionist, brushy mode. Again, there's so many layers to it, this seemingly simple composition. Formally, it was really ridiculed. Courbet was a provocateur, let's face it. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly how to needle the critics. So first of all, it's important to show him in the beginning of the exhibition because he's kind of the progenitor of realism, which is the first quote-unquote modernist movement in the mid-19th century. But formally, in a painting like The Wave, he's using this really loose brushwork throughout. And then the thing that really wrangled the critics and that they responded to quite negatively was his use of the palette knife to kind of trawl on this really thick impasto white at the crest of the wave. And, the use of palette knife or like any brushwork that just didn't seem finely finished was totally antithetical to critics and the Academy in the 19th century. So yeah, all of these artists were ridiculed quite openly in their time. I mean, the word impressionists was a critique that was offered by a critic who said these aren't paintings, they're impressions of paintings. And of course, Monet and his cohorts understood that this was a brilliant PR move to call themselves the Impressionists. Same thing with the Fauves. Fauve means wild beast, and they were sort of made fun of because of their arbitrary use of color. And Matisse and his friends were like, yeah, this is a good way to market ourselves. And there's a great Fauvist painting in the exhibition by Matisse.
It kind of takes me back to, I think, that the metaphor again of music. I don't know, Drew and I were talking about this a while back at how, sort of like, today's punk will be classic, years from now. But music that we're listening to, or music we were listening to in the 90s that was fresh and like, they called it alternative, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really it was a break from the mainstream pop. And now that's on classic rock radio stations. You look at the 70s, or the original sort of, the punk and even late 60s, and what are they kind of working against? And of course, then they were all seeing there's a sort of this common thread of being crude, not refined at all, and not really supporting or being a part of the Academy. And I do think that that's something that's worth exploring as one who, I made my bones going through the university, but also departed quickly as I was, starting my own writing and was working through that. I didn't necessarily want a replication of the stuff that I'm reading. I need something that's my own. Is that really sort of the, maybe part of it for some of these guys at the time was, it wasn't that they didn't appreciate any of the other stuff. It's just that they didn't want to replicate any of this, that they wanted to be able to capture what they were seeing the way they were seeing it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, most of these artists were academically trained. Most of them had the quote unquote chops. If they wanted to paint in a highly polished style, they could have. It was a very conscious decision to create a kind of departure. In the same way that a formal innovation in painting would be this, loose brushwork or using the palette knife or using the back of the brush to kind of incise onto the canvas. Distorted guitar was an accident. If you had, if you were, there was no such thing as a distortion. Why would you want distortion in the 1950s, right? If you cranked your amp up too loud, it would become distorted, and that's a bad thing. Hence the name distortion, right? I mean, it's implied in the name. But then it gives birth to rock and roll. And then when Jimi Hendrix uses feedback, as a tool, in the toolbox, it's totally disruptive. It had never been done before. Monet did the same thing by painting outdoors, and having this sketch-like quality to all his work. There's a section in the show called The Nude. It's the smallest section, and it's kind of a gallery that everybody kind of seems to be gravitating toward, interestingly. And there's a subtext to that gallery. You could read it, for one, on the level of, the nude is this like historical academic thing. They're supposed to be beautifully rendered and idealized, thinking about Greco-Roman classical art and things like that. And of course, the modernist approach to the nude was, to show them as real, as possible, kind of warts and all. But also the subtext in that gallery is is this kind of idea of having artworks that are unfinished and unfinished, like with intention. There's a lot of bare canvas in the show. There's a Degas painting in that gallery of a typical kind of nude woman bathing. And it's an unfinished painting. But I think if we look at it today, and it appears finished to our eyes. It appears like this beautiful kind of masterwork, but it's literally an unfinished Degas canvas. And I think to present it not as a finished work, of course, Brooklyn and everyone acknowledges that it's not a finished piece, but it just suggests the kind of rupture that was happening at this time and the way that it totally shifted the way we look at art.
Yeah. I think that concept in and of itself is pretty badass. I mean, just the idea that we've talked about this several times on the show when we talk about artists and writers and how collectively and individually we are so small compared to the art that we create. And if you finish that piece, you have somehow controlled it. You've somehow mastered that. But if it's unfinished, it's almost as if it is an act of rebellion. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine seeing that, for the first time in France or wherever on a wall, and your expectation is that it's supposed to be finished, and it's not. And it was intentionally not finished for that reason. I mean, that's cool.
Yeah, definitely.
For lack of a better word, that's just cool.
It was a response to the time. It was, in the midst of industrialization. If you think about it, like the 19th century in Paris, what's happening? We go from gas lamps throughout the city to, ultimately electricity and electric lighting in this time period. The way that the world looks changes. And I think that, for these artists, there was almost nothing else to do but to respond to that and respond to this idea of a change in experience.
Change that is happening and sometimes in ways that feels incremental but become massive. And then later on in this period, change that is ultimately and utterly destructive. And that's a very good point. I mean, just thinking about how we take for granted lighting and how that in and of itself changes the way we literally see things. But then, something that you have seen for some probably all of their lives up to that point, and then suddenly gone. I mean, we're talking, several massive wars, 2 world wars, various occupations, brutality in between. So then it really does make it so that who better to define what they're seeing than the artist?
Yeah, and they're perfect examples of that in the show. I'm thinking of paintings by Jules Breton, who was, realism was elevating sort of the underclasses or the working classes or laborers to the level of high art and saying that these subjects are actually worth looking at and recognizing and understanding. And there's also, especially in Breton's work, there's this sense of, well, what is actually lost here? What are we losing with industrialization? Is like these communities or like this burgeoning global economic trade routes and things like that. It's like what's being lost here, and this is worth preserving. And that tension between tradition and modernity is something that comes out throughout the exhibition.
Sure, and completely appropriate today. We're still grappling with the same idea, right? I mean, it's not necessarily the trade route anymore, in as much as it is the idea of this constant tension between globalization and localization, and then what do we keep as part of a traditional value versus, what are we willing to forego the more we learn about things and see things. And that's one of the things that I love about exhibitions like this, is that, yes, you are definitely seeing a piece of history, but with a lowercase h, but it's completely appropriate and still drives at the same questions that we should be asking ourselves today. And we can enjoy looking at some pretty damn fine pieces of art while we're doing it. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's so relevant to today, and a lot of the conversations museums are having today about representation in the museum. This is the beginning of people saying, we want to see ourselves in this work. I mean, this is a time where disposable income becomes, more prevalent, where classes are kind of shifting and, a bourgeois is sort of burgeoning. And it's like, once you have the masses who can have the means to some degree to get out in the world, to become educated and to learn new things and be in these urban centers like Paris. It's like suddenly it becomes, they're looking for their relevance. They're looking to see themselves on the walls, you know, and we're this is a conversation that's been happening for 100 years. It's kind of the beginning of identity politics, actually.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, but it's an ongoing revolution, right? I mean, you know, ongoing. Man, I think our listeners, if they haven't come by now to see it, they really need to. How long is the exhibition going?
The show is up until January 5th, so there's
plenty of time. So there's no excuse, right?
There's no excuse, and I'm very happy to say that the galleries have been so busy. I mean, we had 50 people show up for a tour group the other day.
Wow.
Which is on like a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Which is great. I mean, the galleries were packed.
Yes.
You know, and I was just walking through today, and, you know, there are tour groups, and there's families, and there's just, you know, people come out for this stuff. I mean, it really resonates. I think, you know, part of the draw is the names, of course.
Sure.
You know, but I think once you get in the galleries, it's not just Parisian artists. You know, there are Hungarian artists, there are Russian artists, there are artists from kind of all over Europe. And it sort of supports this idea of globalism,
right?
In a sense. You know, it's beginning to look toward that.
Michael Neumeister is the senior curator here at the Columbia Museum of Art. You can see French Moderns, Monet to Matisse, 1850 to 1950, which is on view now until January 5th. Up next.
The music I was most attracted to, usually, like, it wasn't guitar for me, it was like intricate vocals. So that's why I love the Cocteau Twins or like Susie and the Banshees. And so that was like what got me whenever I was a young melodramatic teenager.
My friend, Liz Elliott.
Hey y'all, producer Drew here with a quick question. Are you a CMA member? Relax, it's fine. I can't hear your answer anyway. But if you are, I just wanted to say thanks. And if you're not, maybe stick around for a second before you hit skip forward on your podcast app. CMA memberships put art to work for your community, connecting visitors from all walks of life with unforgettable creative experiences. Your support helps make art accessible, helping the museum keep community benefits like free admission days available to the public each month. It helps support our public programming, including this podcast, and allows us to continue to bring you new and exciting art exhibitions every year. Of course, you get plenty of perks too, including priority registration for events, special discounts on classes, camps, and merchandise, and admission not only to the CMA, but over 150 Southeastern museums. At the CMA, inspiration is around every corner, and it's all thanks to you. Fuel creativity and South Carolina with a CMA membership. Now, thank you. And back to the show.
Okay, so wow. So I am here, and I'm going to pause for a second on the word here with my good friend Liz Elliott. We're not in studio, y'all. So, it's election day, and we wanted to be sure that we were able to vote and do what we needed to do. And so I'm here in my house, and Liz is there in her house, but we were able to talk to each other. Liz, it's awesome to have you back on the show.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be back on. Is this my third time or my fourth time?
I think this is your third time. Fourth time we have champagne.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. You're in the winner's circle. And I do foresee that happening soon because, what can I say? I just like you. And you and I both, I think, have a sort of a kindred spirit in the sense that we kind of have marched to our own beat, if I can use that cliche. Not to say that we've always just kind of done our own thing, but we've certainly put our bend to it, which I think is a little appropriate since we are talking about French moderns at CMA. And one of the things that has kind of come up in discussions is the fact that, these great artists, these people that we look to now as these great masters, if you will, we're not really embraced, if you will, by the academy of their time, and or by some of their gatekeeper peers, whatever we want to call them. And yet they are by far some of the most recognized artists that we have on view at just about any art museum. And so I was just thinking about, what writer could we bring on that would kind of have this rebellious streak, but still attention to convention long enough to know it, master it, and then just bend it all up and make it our own. And that is you. I mean, that is your work.
Nice of you to say.
Hey, have you been over to see?
I have, yes, I have.
Yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because the art era that I most obsess over is the surrealist era that kind of overlaps with this one. So it was really interesting to think about surrealism within the same sort of context or overlap with this one. Because I would say of all art movements, like surrealism, especially female surrealists, has influenced me the most. And some of those women were even writers as well. And so there were a couple of pieces in this show, one of which was like blatantly surrealist, and then others that were kind of like leading up to it. And it was really interesting to think about like what these artists were doing stylistically at that time period, in conjunction with like my favorite art era, if that makes any sense. And so that was like kind of like the lens through which I looked at it, because I've just been steeped in that. And I taught a class, it's like a South Carolina Honors College version of 304 Women's and Gender Studies. And it was called The Politics of the Marvelous. And so there's a whole section on like surrealism and the occult. So I was just kind of inundated in like painting and painting analysis and like discussing it with my students and doing exercises like where we would take a painting and like create a short story or a poem based on it, that sort of thing, which is something I know you're really into, like where you sort of jump between art forms and use one to inspire the other. So that's kind of like the lens through which I was looking at it. And then I also was thinking a lot about like how the impressionistic elements kind of almost seem bourgeois to us today, but at the time it was incredibly rebellious. And so you kind of have to put it into context like that. Like, there's a lot of grannies with like Degas paintings like in their hallways or something.
Sure.
But then when you think about like maybe that type of impressionism was considered almost blasphemous or radical at the time.
Which, we embrace fully, right? I want to come back to surrealism. What was it that, because you said you always kind of leaned or been drawn to it. What is it about it that draws you?
Well, so I discovered Leonora Carrington as a writer around shortly after 2011. She had lived in Mexico City from like during or after World War II until the time that she died. And so after she died, I think it was the Feminist Press published like a collected short story edition of her work. And it's incredible. It's like it fits right in with fabulous female writers like Karen Russell or Kelly Link or Sophia Samatar, writers like that. She was definitely, people call her a proto-feminist, but she's actually like just a straight up feminist. I made a leap from her literary work, which is like incredibly avant-garde, to her visual paintings, It's kind of hard to separate the two. And then I got really immersed in surrealism. And so the first thing about it that I love is that it was the first like major art movement that actually really embraced women artists. Like they were participating fully. They were in the exhibitions. And then like Andre Breton was like the theorist for the movement, and he called for something that he called like the total occultation of surrealism, where you move beyond like embracing kind of like dream-like logic into like actually like a full-on kind of obsession with like occult symbology and stuff, which kind of went along with the sort of post-Freudian kind of like movement up to stuff like the triple goddess or like Wicca and like neo-occult stuff that was happening in the 60s and 70s. And the male surrealists did kind of like glamorize the women in their circle as these highly sexualized and mysterious muses that would like grant them access to the unconscious and the supernatural. But then at the same time, they were highly respected. So 3 of the surrealist female artists that I'm obsessed with, they kind of like took this sort of male idea of what a woman was, but then they kind of flipped it and they just really embraced like a total feminist occult form of painting. And contrary to the French modernists, they kind of went back to the Renaissance to pull on a more like kind of like realistic painting style, but then they mixed it with dreamlike images. But I feel like if you didn't have French modernism, which was like a huge stylistic challenge to the status quo, then you wouldn't have surrealism. And then it was Yves Tanguy, the piece Dress of the Morning from 1946. That was like the most conspicuously surreal piece in this exhibition. And it was the one that I was most fascinated by because it's all about dreams and the unconscious. And those organic shapes are abstract, but they also have a kind of like biological kind of look to them that reminds me of even something from like the French surrealist animation film Fantastic Planet. If you've ever seen that, it's completely psychedelic. And also one thing I'll say, if you look at surrealist art, it's like spans from the 20s all the way up to, I guess, like even the 60s and 70s. Yeah, definitely into the 60s and 70s and even beyond that, because they were still doing it and they were still alive. But a lot of it looks like 1980s heavy metal album covers.
Right. I mean, it does feel like, especially given its time, a liberating experience, you know, whether through genre or gender, of really kind of pushing out and breaking that convention, right? I mean, there's realism and then there's surrealism, whether one is responding to the other or not. Now, I do think there is an argument to be made for the entire canon. If you think of if you look at the canon of art, music, whatever, it seems like, if you go backwards, point D is responding to point C and point C is responding to point B and, so on and so forth. I think if you look at music, for instance, you can really kind of see that, and I'm going there now because that's, you were kind of talking about 80s metal covers and stuff like that. But I was drawn to metal. I was kind of a metal head. But I mean, when I was younger.
Yeah, that was how I shifted from like metal to kind of like, I guess you would call it kind of goth new wave, romantic kind of stuff like Cocteau Twins, The Cure, Bauhaus, very dramatic stuff. I grew up in Hampton County, and so I didn't know about any like new wave or goth or, I guess you would just call it even like 80s art music. I didn't have access to it until I moved to the metropolis of Aiken, South Carolina. And so kind of metal was like, it seemed like the most viable thing to me when I was like in 9th grade at Hampton High School,
Well, yeah, I mean, right. If you grew up in South Carolina, yeah, rock was usually Southern rock or, the psychedelic kind of classic rock, depending on what your parents might have listened to or what an older cousin or older sibling might have turned you on to. But metal became, if I was cranking that in my bedroom, it was an act of defiance, I mean, in fact, I probably learned more about English literature and Egyptian lore from Iron Maiden and things like that, But then what happened, I guess when I was about a sophomore in high school, I got turned on to punk, and the Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, I suppose, early Talking Heads. But then it was almost like no sooner was I introduced to punk, I was also introduced to post-punk. I had both of these things kind of going in the same realm. So got that on one side. And there was always the one element that kind of held it all together, that, there was something about it that pulled me in. And it was obviously lyrics. I think those were some of the first poets I think I probably came in contact with and fell in love with. But it was guitar. It was just the way it was, whether it was just a simple riff or it was some complicated thing. And when I think about that in relationship to the way you see all these artistic movements sort of happening where, there's an element that they keep, but then they do something to it that really pisses off a lot of people at the time.
Oh yeah,
right?
interesting. Okay, yeah.
But it's what's interesting though is like when I talk to a lot of people about punk, a lot of folks think about the 80s, and they're thinking of the Dead Kennedys and the Circle Jerks and sort of the skate punk kind of thing. But it wouldn't have happened if you didn't have a couple of guys getting in a garage, only really need to know 3 chords. You don't even have to sing or know how to sing. And yet you produce this thing, and for critics to look at it and be like, how is this music? I think parallels to what was probably happening at the time for a lot of the for artists and certainly for the French modernists, which kind of gets us to a bigger question of like, who the hell gets to decide that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's true. And well, I do think one connection here is that the expressionists landed on a style that would enable them to produce these kind of vibrant images, but they didn't necessarily have to have like, Rembrandt level painting skills, but they could still produce like a really vibrant image, I don't know much about the history of it, but I know that some people who like shifted over to like expressionism or impressionism, like they might even be able to paint like a, perfectly standard portrait that fit in with the paradigm that like went before that. But then they would like shift over to that more stylistically expressive mode. And then others maybe had like skill limitations, but they could still express themselves. And I think the same could be said for like different kinds of punk bands,
Sure. And writers, right? I mean, I think that's something that, I think I was having a discussion with, and it's the age old discussion. Should you MFA or should you not MFA? Do you have to, can you be trained to be a writer or can you just read and respond to what you're reading? And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I would say when it comes to our writing, we do our own thing. I mean, it's not necessarily the most conventional way. Probably won't put us on bestseller list, but it's for the art. It's always for the art.
Yeah. And, whenever I was in grad school, I did go to grad school, but the way that I look up at MFAs, it's what they provide for you is time and a community of writers. Like, I don't think that they can help you like get better as a writer because you're devoting time and you're exposed to other writers you've never heard of. But like, you have to have like the basic will and then maybe some talent to begin with. But like, I don't think writers can be like trained exactly. They can just kind of hone their craft and be exposed to things or whatever. But it was interesting that when I was in grad school, the kind of model for the perfect short story was like the Iowa workshop thing.
Yep.
Sort of like a quiet realist story where someone has an epiphany in maybe an apartment in New York City or something.
Right.
And then
may or may not be raining.
So I went to Penn State and one of my professors was this guy named Paul West, and he exposed us to all kinds of like experimental writing from the 60s and 70s, Angela Carter, John Hawkes, all kinds of writers, Jean Genet, like all kinds of stuff. So my mind just kind of exploded and I kind of turned into like an experimental fabulist. And then I was reading a lot of like Renaissance lit. So my style was hyper Baroque and ridiculous and barely readable. But what I'm trying to say is it was the polar opposite of what was like stylish at the time. And I couldn't get anything published. And then by the time I started publishing for real in magazines that mattered was around like 2006 or something. And then I would say that like shortly after that, like my first book, The Wilds, kind of fit some kind of arc that was happening in the culture where suddenly genre tropes that had been regarded as pulp fiction stuff were suddenly being incorporated into high literary works. Like, people like George Saunders, who would have like, zombies, or Karen Russell would have like vampires that suck lemons or something. And I feel like there's still like this weird kind of like boundary, like this is genre fiction and this is literary fiction, but it's really been deconstructed over the last like 20 years or so. And so I was writing like fabulous genre bending fiction when I was in grad school and after I was in grad school. But nobody wanted that kind of thing. They were doing like realist, epiphany writing, basically, a philosophical insight kind of thing. And so it was sort of like I couldn't get anything published. And then that trend sort of like became more acceptable and even praised. And then that's whenever my stuff started getting published.
Yeah. You're right about the MFA in terms of you are exposed to a lot that you would not otherwise be exposed to, whether it's other writers, whether it's other published writers or writers, in your workshop. And it also helps you to develop a sort of a thick skin if you're going to go into a publish or perish mindset, which was good for me because when you feel absolutely compelled to do it, to write, what's the end game? Do I just end up with a shoebox full of poems or does it get out there to the world? And then there's this weird part where you begin to think, is that the only way you can achieve any kind of affirmation in what you're doing? Am I being the artist and I'm generating art for art's sake? Or, do I feel like I have something that I just want to share with the world? I just want to see what other people, think or react. But a very similar thing in workshops, I would, get a lot of praise for, whether it was a short story, because, MFA poets had to take fiction workshops and vice versa. And I remember the professor at the time was like, you really need to be sending out your work to magazines, and which she didn't know, but that's exactly what I was doing, but I wasn't getting published with fiction. But poetry, I could be as wild as I wanted. I could be as daring and bold as I wanted, and it would get picked up.
Another thing that happened to me in grad school that was very useful is, so I was pretty naive about like where to send stuff. So I was sending things to Harper's and the New Yorker and getting rejections.
Yes, same.
And then so like when I was at UGA, University of Georgia, getting a PhD, but with a creative writing focus, like, because I'm just an institutionalized human. And I could write a novel. I call it the fake PhD because I wrote a novel for my dissertation. But Kevin Young, who I think is like the poetry editor of the New Yorker now, ironically, he was very nice. And I went to him to talk about getting published because I heard that he knew about weird magazines. And so he suggested 2 magazines to me. One was called Third Bed, currently edited by M.T. Anderson. And then the other one was called Fence, that was edited by Ben Marcus at the time. I'd never heard of either of them. And I submitted to both of them. And those were like 2 of my first publications, which led to other publications. So if it hadn't been for that professor in the MFA program,
right,
who told me, you're not going to get published in the New Yorker, probably, at least not now, maybe one day, but probably never. And you might want to try these. And I didn't even know those existed, but they were like magazines focused on like experimental work and weird stuff. And so like finding that would not have been possible probably without the MFA. And that was like the internet existed during that time, but it didn't exist in the way that it exists now, where it's like easier to find things,
Yeah. You had to buy the book, right? Was it?
Yeah, there was like different like print publications that you could get at the library that would have lists of things, but there was no way to kind of try to figure out like what these journals were like. And then you could maybe find one in the library, but other than that, it was difficult. So,
and that's a real good point to make, because I think I did the same thing, because you hear about these places. You don't know about the other journals, but you've heard of the New Yorker. You've heard of the Paris Review, right. So I'll send to that. That's what you do.
And then your heart gets broken. You're like, oh.
Yeah. Especially after they kept it for like, half a year to a year. And then you get this tiny little rejection slip that was just, cut, from a larger rejection slip. I think to kind of pull it all in, all these labels and ways that we codify artists and writers and poets and, trying to find boxes to put everything in, when all it really comes down to is you write what you write because that's what you want to write, or you feel compelled that you have to write it. And the same with me. I'm sure the same with the work that we'll see in the museum. It's not to take away any of that. It's not to take away the geniusness of it. It's not to take away the work and the study it took to get to a point where, you can actually create something that withstands the test of time. But it's always to the audience, right? It's always the critic that gets to make the statement about the work, which usually don't even make it really about the work in as much as they make it about the artist. The work seems to be an afterthought most of the time, or it's the entire body of work that is somehow represented in one piece, which is a little crazy too, right? I mean, we're all, I think, beautiful, wonderful weirdos. And I think if kids, you're listening at home, if you want to be an artist, just be a weirdo. That's your first step. But
indulge your weirdest tendencies.
But you've got some new work coming.
Oh yeah. So I have a new collection of stories called Hellions. So it's got like a really good sort of Southern sounding title, but the work kind of ranges from like medieval Europe into the contemporary South and then even into the future. The concept of Hellions, like the concept of a rebellious child that needs to be like punished, a hoodlum, a hellion, a troublesome, rebellious child is like the main idea. But then there's also like a lot of weird sort of like kind of occult ideas that fit along with that as well. And so it was a kind of great concept to unify these stories, like some of which would take place in medieval Europe and then others are in like, Hampton County in the 80s. So, and then also the interesting thing about like when we're talking about developing your work, it's like I write stories all the time. I think another thing that happens when you become like a writer is when you just have to do it and you get obsessed with it and you have your ritual and you try to do it as much as you can just because you want to, it's almost like a compulsion. So I write a lot of stories and some of them suck and some of them are okay and some of them are good. And then it took me like a few iterations to get this collection that actually came together in a meaningful way. And there was even a former version of this that my agent tried to sell and she couldn't sell it. And I was heartbroken at the time, but now I'm deeply relieved because it's like that book was way inferior to the one that's about to come out. And if it had been published, it probably would have like flopped. And then where would I be? Like, I don't know. This one might flop too, but you know what I'm saying. Just that persistence, like, and that you can keep doing stuff and trying new things and you have a lot of failures. But the main thing that seems to unify most writers that I know is they're just kind of obsessed with writing.
Julia Elliott's writing has appeared in Tin House, the Georgia Review, Conjunctions, the New York Times, Grant Online, and other publications. She's won a Rona Jaffe Award, and her stories have been anthologized in Pushcart Prize Best of Small Presses and the Best American Short Stories. Her debut story collection, The Wilds, was chosen by Kirkus, BuzzFeed, Book Riot, and Electric Literature as one of the best books of 2014 and was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Her first novel, The New and Improved Romy Futch, arrived in October 2015, and her newest novel, The Hellions, will be out in April 2025. And some of the things that we've talked about in this episode about the appearance or the impression that others may have of, an artist or a writer, that may or may not be true, but certainly does not seem to jive with what they think is right or what they think is good or what they think is beautiful. And, I think we owe it to ourselves sometimes to block that noise out and just be ourselves. And I think being ourselves can be an act of rebellion. The fact that, I have to wear many hats. I'm, an administrator in a college, or, I'm in a classroom, or I get to do cool things like I get to do here at the Columbia Museum of Art, or I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a granddad, all these different things. But ultimately, deep down, I am Ray McManus. And that is probably the best act of rebellion I could possibly have. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted by me, Ray McManus, produced and edited by Drew Barron, with special assistance from Joel Ryan Cook. For more information about CMA exhibitions and programs, visit our website at www.columbiamuseum.org.
Special guest for this ad read, Drew Barron. I'm only here for this 10 seconds of the podcast.
Outro.
Now I have to put it in there, but I'm going to include all of this, including what I'm saying right now.